It was snowballs in Davos as Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron picked a fight with German Chancellor Angela Merkel over the euro. It's the European summit this week. Expect Cameron to suffer a severe Germanic handbagging in Brussels. Barack Obama played the class card in his State of the Union speech during the week, telling the rich to cough up more. Meanwhile, his main rival for the US presidency, Newt Gingrich, blasted off in Florida, promising to go where man has boldly gone before, to the moon no less. Not personally, unfortunately. Well, Elvis Presley cautioned against messing with his blue suede shoes. I don't know if the Australian Prime Minister is a fan, but someone certainly stepped on her blue suede shoes, one of which is still missing. Welcome to The Real Deal. This is The Real Deal, and I'm Salma Yaqub, standing in for George Galloway. Well, George is in the fiery heat, political and physical, of the Far East for the next couple of weeks, and he's not topping up his tan. He's on a speaking tour. I'll be catching up with him shortly to find out what he's up to in Malaysia and Indonesia. Well, Britain is, of course, in a gang of one in Europe since David Cameron played his veto. But he's still allowed to turn up to the important meetings, it seems, and heckle from the sidelines. He was in Davos during the week at the World Economic Forum, where he risked souring Britain's relations with Berlin by telling the Germans that they had to put their hands deeper into their pockets to bail out indebted nations like Greece and Italy and save the beleaguered single currency, the euro. I predict Ms Merkel's response this week will be direct and forcible. It's the banks, of course, which brought this all on us, and it was a banker in Britain who was in the firing line last week. Simon Hester is the boss of the Royal Bank of Scotland, which is more than 80% owned by the state after it went belly up. Hester earns £1.2 million a year and now is set to take a bonus worth almost another £1 million, although the bank still owes British taxpayers billions. It was said, of course, of the Bourbon kings that they learnt nothing and forgot nothing. The British government, it seems, has updated that. They've learnt nothing and forgotten everything. Hester is one of those fat cats President Obama wants to take more tax from in the States. The President says the top 1%, the Mitt Romneys of America indeed, should pay more. Mind you, it's taken him almost 4 years to work that one out. Romney failed badly in Florida Republican primary after being forced to reveal his tax returns, which show that this multimillionaire pays less than 15% tax on his income. Apparently, the voting public in Florida puts more weight on tax affairs than the marital kind. His opponents had been attacking him by pointing out he'd been married 3 times and carried on a long, adulterous affair with the present Mrs. Gingrich. But Newt Gingrich won by a convincing majority anyway. The November presidential election promises to be interesting and just that little bit sleazy. The drumbeats for war on Iran are getting louder. Gingrich upped the decibels by declaring that Iran's nuclear scientists should be, as he put it, taken out. And several of them have been. In the televised debate, Gingrich was none too subtle in threatening to go further. If the dictatorship persists, he said, you have to take whatever steps are necessary to break its capacity to have a nuclear weapon. Iran, of course, is not a dictatorship and has always denied attempting to create nuclear weapons. Israel has repeatedly failed to deny that it has hundreds. And we know that it has because of the evidence of the brave and persecuted scientist Mordechai Vanunu. I'll be talking to US defense analyst and military advisor Patricia DiGennaro shortly. But first, it's the normal incumbent of this chair, George Galloway. He's in Indonesia and right now he's on the line from Jakarta. George, so how are you enjoying the show from afar?
Well, it's the real deal if Salma Yaqub's presenting it. That's all I can say about that, and I hope it all goes very well for you. The show here is bakingly hot, extremely humid, but an extremely warm reception.
Fantastic.
Playing to packed houses, as they say, packed with media, packed with people, all keen to join their campaigns for Palestine with the international campaign called Viva Palestina, which, as you very well know, as someone who did a lot to help it get off the ground, from Birmingham in the beginning, has repeatedly broken the siege of Gaza and now seeks to highlight the right of return of the Palestinian people to their homes and their properties from which they were driven by force and which have been stolen from them. So we've launched Viva Palestina Indonesia, which will join relatively nearby Viva Palestina Malaysia and relatively nearby VP Australia, and also Kia Ora, our sister organization in New Zealand. So we really are beginning to build a critical mass in this quarter of the globe. It's a huge quarter, of course. I'm sitting here now in the capital of the world's biggest Muslim country, 200 million Muslims living in Indonesia. They have no diplomatic relations with Israel at all. They've always supported the Palestinian people, always opposed colonialism, and are ready to stand up and join in.
Well, that's absolutely brilliant news. As you pointed out, you're in part of the world where they have more Muslims than in any other part, and most people don't even know that. And the fact that they're joining in the international Viva Palestina convoy, which you started, George, is absolutely fantastic news. Well, it's so good to hear from you, but is it past your bedtime over there? What time is it there now?
Well, it's past midnight, but believe it or not, I'm about to go out to do yet another interview, which is bad news in one way, but good news in another. So if you'll forgive me, I'll let you get on with the show.
Well, thanks so much for joining us still from so far, and good luck with the rest of the tour.
Thank you, Salma.
Goodbye. Well, now, Britain prides itself on being a tolerant, democratic society where the right to protest is enshrined and safeguarded. My studio guest doesn't think so, though. He's George Barder, one of the leaders of the Occupy London movement, which has been camped on the piazza at St Paul's Cathedral for more than 100 days since October. Welcome, George, to The Real Deal. You've just come straight from the High Court trying to put the appeal in. Do tell our viewers what's been happening, what's the story so far?
So round one effectively is over. The first case in the High Court went against us, which was not surprising. When you talk about the right to protest being safeguarded and enshrined, it is important to recognise that it is more enshrined and more safeguarded than most places. The very fact that the camp at St Paul's has been there for 2.5 months and the authorities have had to take us to court is far more than most people across the world have got, and that's a very important reminder of the rights that we do have in this country that previous generations have fought very hard for, and that current generations of politicians are doing a very good job to roll back as fast as possible. I mean, we've seen across the world since 9/11, governments use the pretext of that event to roll back civil liberties, to justify all sorts of aggression.
What basis have the court actually said this?
So
what base have you actually lost at the moment?
So the finding against us is on a number of counts, but the main one is that the Corporation of, and this is the fascinating thing about the case, the Corporation of London, which is known as the money launderer's destination of choice, and the reason it has that title is because it facilitates the corrupt flows of money, especially from Africa, but from all over the world. So when people in countries like the UK are told that poor countries are corrupt, they're not told that it's mainly because it's facilitated by rich countries. But so the Corporation of London is, on the one hand, the target of our protest. It's the institutional embodiment of the 1% of this far too powerful, undemocratic economic sector, and it is also the local authority in charge of highways. So there's very much a question of the corporation coming with two hats, and so it's using its jurisdiction as the local highway authority to claim possession over the highway. And what the case has been fought on is the relevance of various provisions in the European Convention on Human Rights, which was incorporated into UK law in 1998 in the form of the Human Rights Act. And what has happened generally is that the judges, not surprisingly, being generally, old, white, middle-class males that have a strong tendency to see the world in terms much like, other ruling class white old males, have tended, I think, to massively underestimate the relevance of those fundamental rights. We have a sort of crazy situation at the moment where the way these cases proceed, and our cases proceeded, and the precedents that were brought in, seems to imply that there's almost a sort of equal right on the one hand for people just to walk and wander, you know, for people to walk over a very particular bit of pavement rather than another which they could walk round, which is the situation we have at St Paul's. And it's as if that right is almost as important as this kind of enshrined fundamental right to protest, assemble and speak freely.
Because of course the protesters have pointed out time and time again that they're not actually blocking visitors from the cathedral. So it's not the case that people are not being allowed access.
And not only are they not blocking the cathedral, we have fire lanes. You know, about 10 days in, I think we had a meeting with the fire authority, and they told us we needed to have the tents a certain width apart, we need to put in fire lanes, etc. We did all this, so actually people can move through the camp very freely as well as around it. And we are on one of the widest bits of walkway in London. And it's pretty much, and this is a very interesting thing that's come up in the last couple of weeks, it's pretty much the only suitable place in the City of London to do what we're doing, because the Corporation of London has been selling off public land to private owners for the last 30 years. So the reason we're in front of St Paul's Cathedral in the first place, rather than in Paternoster Square, which is the square in front of the London Stock Exchange, which is, you know, which was the specific goal of our protest initially, you know, that's why we're in front of St Paul's. And as you say, there is actually no meaningful obstruction to anybody doing anything in that area. So it does seem like to use the slightly legal terms, it does seem like a capricious and oppressive case to bring against this, because this is such an important protest.
Pointing out something which could be very embarrassing to the British government and elites. And I was quite interested that even the BBC carried a report that in Davos, the discussion there was being influenced by the Occupy movement, because they've started to have debates there about the gap between the rich and poor, which would not have happened had protests like yours not taken place. So on the one hand, it seems they want to demoralise people and say, well, there's no point in protesting, but clearly they seem to also be running quite scared.
Absolutely, and I think after nearly, I mean, we had our 100th day birthday this week, which coincided with my own birthday, which was quite nice.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. But yeah, we have clearly changed the mainstream political narrative, both on this side of the Atlantic and the other.
Well, Obama himself has just said that the rich have to pay and that they haven't done their bit. And it's kind of rhetoric we haven't heard.
I mean, pay. So, I mean, it's very important that we realise how far we have to go. You know, we've Chapter 1, in a sense, is over. We've got to the first step where we've actually forced the powers that be to start talking about the things they should be talking about, to get them to actually start talking about those things in terms of the real nature of the problems and the real nature of the solutions that we need to see. That's a much more difficult matter, because Obama is talking about taxing the incredibly wealthy, you know, multi-billionaires, 30% of their income. Which at a time where that country, like many others, is really struggling to find the money for things that people really, really need, seems like an incredibly small amount. So yes, it's a step forward, but we have a very long way to go.
It's a sign of the times that even that seems to be quite radical.
And Cameron similarly, he's started talking last week about moral capitalism, which to me is an absolute nonsense and an insult if you are at the very same time pushing ahead with draconian cuts that are taking away from, you know, vulnerable people the things that they most need, like the healthcare, decent education, disabled people's mobility allowance, any number of community centres, libraries, things that make our communities decent and that give democracy a good name. And I think it's that's an important thing to pause on in some ways, because the ideas of freedom and democracy are effectively used as propaganda fronts for all sorts of brutality across the world, and it's clearly not the fact that 51% of people might have chosen something, or 35 usually choose the government, that makes a democracy something worth having. It's the rights they manage to afford to their people and the freedoms that people actually enjoy, and the support given to people when in need. That's, for me, what makes democracy a laudable idea, because, you know, it means power of the people, and clearly for that to have any sort of moral weight, it has to be that power shared, you know, not power for some and power for others.
Well, you use the word moral there, and obviously you're talking about deep, important political issues. I think there's a certain irony that St Paul's Cathedral, a church building, is actually evicting protesters. When you consider in the Bible, absolutely, Jesus, peace be upon him, himself was there literally overturning the tables of the moneylenders. Talk about direct action.
Yeah, not only that, and it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because it brings me on to one of the significant grounds of my appeal, which was that our Article 9 rights, our exercise of religious observance, which many people, including myself, very much feel the occupation is. You know, it is an attempt to embody the compassion that you find as pretty much the central teaching in virtually every religion across the world. And we had Jesse Jackson, who, for anyone who doesn't know, was a civil rights leader alongside Martin Luther King.
And also
he's also a priest and a long-time activist for social justice, and a reverend, as you say. And he came to Occupy and said that, you know, Jesus would have been outside with the occupiers. And the wonderful thing that a priest who came to visit us, because there are many people in the Church of England who do stand behind what we're doing and stand against the complicit brutality of the Church of England over the years, which has supported, in effect, slavery, colonialism, etc. But yeah, so the first two things that the Jewish authorities tried to get Jesus for was purity laws, so the equivalent in modern day being health and safety, which is one of the parts of the corporation's case, and the second was misuse of the temple grounds. And so what do we think he was, you know, what kind of misuse do we think that was? Exactly the kind of thing that Occupy is doing.
Huge parallels.
Absolutely. Going out, standing in front of the temple, not just sort of doing the signs and saying the words in the church, but actually talking to people about the need to fight for a compassionate revolution. And I think you know, and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, also was fighting for that compassionate revolution.
And there was a ring of prayer, wasn't there? And people from all faiths, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Jews, actually joined together outside St. Paul's Cathedral to join.
That hasn't happened yet. If we do get evicted from that site, there has been a promise from various groups to come down, interfaith groups, to come down and form that ring of prayer and to stand up for the compassionate essence of what this movement is about. Because it's not about anger and opposition.
Yes.
It's really about simply embodying the values that 99% of us across the world already claim to hold.
Thank you so much for coming to the studio and sharing that with us. And no doubt we'll be coming back to you, because this story certainly is one that we want to keep a close eye on. Thanks to George about us there. Well, stay with me. There'll be more coming up from the States after this. I said in the introduction that the drumbeats for war against Iran are growing, particularly in the United States, where notably the Republican contenders for presidency seem to be trying to out-hawk each other. Predictably, Israel is stoking up tensions. Prime Minister Netanyahu clearly doesn't trust President Obama to do the job to his satisfaction and won't be seeking US permission for an attack, sources say. Moreover, if he does decide to launch an attack, he'll only give Obama 12 hours notice. Just enough time then to get to the air raid shelters. Joining me now from New York is the distinguished academic and analyst Patricia DiGennaro. Patricia is a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute and a professor at New York University. Patricia, welcome again to The Real Deal. I know that you also lecture and talk to the military. There's clearly political posturing here in the run-up to November's election. Is that all there is to it, or are we in the softening up stages for a real attack on Iran, attempting to take out its nuclear facilities?
Well, it's definitely political posturing. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I think the candidates, especially the Republican on the GOP side, always try to outdo, as you said, who's more hawkish than the other one. And so we have Mitt Romney saying he's going to make the U.S. military larger than anyone's seen before, and Newt Gingrich as well is saying, basically we have to look at the threats and decide how to work the military around that, which is definitely the truth. But I think neither one of them are really talking about the basic issue that the U.S. is having a deficit crunch problem right now. The military is being forced to reduce its structure a little bit. It's going to be $100 or so million that are going to come out of the budget, which was announced yesterday. And I think, these are things that the candidates are not keeping in mind. I mean, just quickly, the second part of that is whether or not these drum beats are ongoing. And I think they are on both sides of the basically the political spectrum. And, the reason is that, the U.S., I think, is really trying every coercive measure it can instead of a relationship type of measure to make Iran basically comply with its bidding. And that's
could I just ask you then, you're saying that the U.S. is really trying very hard to push Iran in a diplomatic way, but some people may think, well, considering there's a huge military build-up, we're seeing 50,000 more troops going into the area from the United States. We're seeing the fact that sanctions have already been imposed, and from July the 1st, there'll be no oil being traded from the US and its European partners. Is that not itself a declaration of war?
Well, I don't think the U.S. is trying diplomatically at all. They're trying really coercive measures with high-level military threats. And then in addition to that, trying to get the European Union, one of Iran's largest trading partners, basically to start upping sanctions and really strangling the sanctions much more than they already are on the people there. No, I don't think this is diplomatic at all. I think actually they should move in a diplomatic way. Posturing on both sides for warfare is just asking for problems.
Well, that would be probably a sentiment many viewers would share. But in your estimation, analysing what's actually happening with Israel's statements, the actions of the United States government and the increasing sanctions, how likely do you think it is that before the November elections a strike will actually take place, whether it's by Israel itself or jointly with America and its allies?
Well, I think what they're trying to do is really push these coercive measures and actually make Iran balk first or move first. And that's what, I think all of these military maneuvers and pressures are doing. It would be a big mistake, I think, for the Iranian government to strike first or make some kind of military, movement to really give the U.S. or Israel a reason to strike. And then they can say, well, they provoked us, basically. We said they were going to provoke us, and we're right about that. So I would be very careful as the Iranian government to do that. They have some leverage. They have some leverage as the third largest oil producer. Some people are very, very dependent on the oil that's coming out of there, and I think they need to use that. And let's push the diplomacy a little bit.
And do you think if Iran was to do that, as I mentioned, it's July when the actual contracts will end, according to the European side who've agreed sanctions. But if Iran was to unilaterally say, well, we will stop supplying oil as from now as part of diplomatic leverage, do you think that would have some impact? Because clearly Europe is very, very vulnerable on that.
It's very vulnerable on that, and I think it would definitely have impact. The difficulty for Iran and the challenge for Iran is going to be whether or not it can sell that oil to another party, and I think that's pretty probable that they can, between China or India or another buyer. So those things need to get into place before they can really put in pressure. But at this point, I think Italy, Greece, and in particular are very vulnerable to stopping the imports of Iranian oil. And this is just going to come to a head. And I think Iran maybe would want to step out in front and say, okay, let's get back to negotiations. And here are my desires, and here are my points that I want I want done.
So just finally then, what would you be predicting in the next few months?
It's always hard to predict the future, Usually I'm very good at it, but this, I'm always apprehensive about it. I think there is going to be continued pressure on Iran. I think it's really going to depend on the way Iran responds to it. And I would hope that, they do not respond in any military way, because that would give the U.S. and Israel exactly, I think, what they're looking for. And then second to that, no one's asking or no one really knows the intentions of the nuclear program. So, I guess it's up to Iran to decide how they want to move forward on negotiations, and maybe they should set some of the parameters.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing your insights there, Patricia. I'm so sorry we don't have more time, but no doubt we'll be coming back to this very important topic in the coming weeks. Thank you for joining us. Well, that's all we have time for, I'm afraid, in my first time on The Real Deal. I hope you've enjoyed the programme. Remember, if you'd like to get in touch about any of the subjects discussed this week, you can tweet me at Salma Yaqub. I'd love to hear from you. Well, I'll be back next week, same time, same place, standing in for George Galloway. Join me then.